Welcome to our podcast, Leading Past Limits. We share lessons learned from the hard-won experience of mission-driven leaders so that you expand your horizons as a leader that places service before self. I'm Kumar Kibble, a leadership coach and the principal at GuideQuest. I've been passionate about developing leaders since graduating from West Point more than 30 years ago, and have led high-performing teams as a military officer, special agent, diplomat, government, and corporate executive. Now I partner with leaders and teams as a coach to help unlock their potential and maximize their impact. In this first season, join me in learning from entrepreneurs, CEOs, Army generals, police chiefs, war heroes, thought leaders, and more. Be sure to subscribe and don't miss out on lessons learned from the real world School of Hard Knocks. Our guest today is Colonel Matthew Packard. Colonel Packard started his career with the Colorado State Patrol in 2000. He rose through the ranks to become the 9th Chief of the Colorado State Patrol in 2017. And in that role, he leads a 1,200-person organization. During his diverse career, he's led operations and initiatives involving Homeland Security, where he served as the Deputy Director of the state's nationally recognized Fusion Center, hazardous materials, criminal investigations, executive security, and field operations. He also serves on the board of directors at the International Association of Chiefs of Police and as a commissioner for the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. In an area that really speaks to my heart, Colonel Packard has maintained a commitment to patrol member wellness and service. He's devoted to providing his people with the resources they need to be successful in both their personal and professional lives. Matt, welcome to the show.
Kumar, thanks very much. I'm glad to be here and good to connect with you again, my friend.
All right. Well, let's begin with what led you into the Colorado State Patrol. What drew you to law enforcement and the patrol in particular?
You know, I'd like to say there's a great, long lifetime story, but a couple of things. And lightheartedly, I wanted to be a state trooper, and they have really neat cars. And my dad will tell you they had the best looking light bars and all that stuff, and a good looking car. And well, that's certainly true. But truthfully, I was really looking for an opportunity to serve. I grew up in a community that was military heavy. My grandfather served in the military, always had a lot of respect for service. And I wanted to find a career that I felt connected to at the core, where I could serve people and try to make life a little bit better for somebody. And I became really, really interested in a career in law enforcement.
And what did you, when you came on with these expectations and this idea of what, it meant to be a trooper. What did you believe at the beginning of your career that you feel differently about now, so many years later?
Yeah, when I first started, what was sexy about the profession was, investigations. And in fact, my career goals coming through, I graduated with a degree in accounting because I wanted to go be an FBI agent. And I thought that's just kind of sexy to be an FBI agent. And but I was going to be a police officer for a couple of years, and then go make the jump to be a federal agent. And I came on with the patrol, and I was opened my eyes to how you can have this really immediate impact, right? And I was really. It was fun, quite frankly. They gave me a car that looked cool, right, and went fast, and they just said, "Go find bad guys and make Colorado a better place." I said, "Boy, this is really neat," and I thought that I had this ability to make impact in this community, and but I really shortchanged how much of an impact you can have. And I think initially, even on a traffic stop, I was convinced that I was helping that person. But I really didn't understand how one conversation at 2:00 in the morning on the side of the road could change a perception of a community about a whole profession, right? And I think that's something that I appreciate today so much more, that it's one-on-one interactions that matter. And I didn't feel like I could make a broader change, that much of an impact as a young trooper. That, man, if I could figure out how to show that to every trooper out there, every police officer out there today, that conversation that you're having right now could be huge.
Yeah, there are a few things that strike me about what you said. One is I've never quite equated sexy and accounting, but you're adding the FBI in there, so I get it.
Yeah.
But what I really like is your comment on this one conversation at a time. And it also strikes me that for those that wear the uniform and that are in patrol, I mean, you really have the opportunity to prevent crime or to prevent some bad thing from happening versus responding to it and investigating it after the fact. So would you unpack that a little bit, because you mentioned it a couple times, this ability to change or influence things based on a conversation. Give us an example of what that looks like.
You know what, I talk about this when I'm talking to our troopers about how important those interactions can be, because a story, and quite frankly, I think it's really relevant with what's going on in the world right now. Is in our profession, it's really easy to get focused on the act or the crime that's being prevented, and that you can stop the timeline right there, and not have an acknowledgement of how that might impact the greater good of a community, because that sometimes, quite frankly, it's just so far out. And so I think what that leads us to is very maybe I should say task-driven conversations. When you talk to a trooper about talking to a member of someone you're suspected of a crime, what you're trying to get evidence to help support that conviction, right? That's
Right.
you're driven, on the simplest context. Well, why were you going so fast, right? And they're giving you that answer. And hey, that's great for ticket notes, and that's great for making your stats look good. But that doesn't help the greater purpose of what we're trying to do. And if you really step back and say what we're trying to do is make Colorado a safer place, and in that context, to make Colorado's roads safer by having drivers that obey the laws, that are there to help to keep people from dying and getting hurt. So maybe if you take the time in that conversation to talk about that the reason that we're working here right now is because this stretch of road or this community has been stricken by a lot of car crashes that we can attribute to excessive speed. And so you're not building your ticket. You're explaining to them why that's important, and hopefully the next time they're a better driver, not because they're worried about the fines, but that they recognize the danger. And that's a conversation they can take back to family members and community members.
I love what you just said, because I mean, and that applies, I think, not only to the person you're stopping on the side of the road, but to the people that compose your workforce, right? Is connecting what they do, which might seem kind of routine or mundane in the moment, to that greater purpose. Yeah, I mean, I think it was famously, was it Kennedy who talked, someone encountered a janitor, and the janitor, said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm putting a man on the moon."
That's right.
I mean, I love that. So, and that's important, I think, for even just building the relationships. I'm going to ask you more about this in detail later, but with the community, especially in the times we face right now.
You know what? I had the opportunity several years ago. The chief of the patrol at the time asked me to go testify in opposition to some legislation that was being considered in our state. That it was in the wake of the situation in Ferguson, mm-hmm. and police reform type things. And I had this opportunity that was a really uncomfortable room at our state capitol. It's the biggest hearing room, and it was me and 3 or 4 police chiefs. And then a room packed wall to wall with folks that weren't so friendly with law enforcement. And it was story after story after story of all the misgivings and wrongs that law enforcement has been done. But there was one conversation that really stuck with me. It was a woman who talked about her granddaughter being stopped by some random cop in suburban Denver for some bogus violation. And she was telling this story. A black woman, her daughter was black, and had her boyfriend was in the vehicle as well, also a black young man. And it was all predicated in her mind on this BS stop because it was in suburban Colorado, suburban Denver, that clearly the only reason the cop stopped him was because there was 2 black kids. But as she's talking about the stop, I'm thinking to myself, I'd have stopped that car. It's 7 o'clock at night, and she checked the curb. And if you talk to any state trooper, someone that hits the curb, that's someone that might be drinking.
Right.
And long story a little bit shorter is the boyfriend went to jail. The traffic stop started off on a bad spot. And I just, not knowing both sides of the story, but I have to think that if that police officer would have taken the time to talk about why we stop people when they hit the curb,
right,
that maybe that whole contact goes different. And rather than talking about how her boyfriend went to jail, she talks about how, hey, the police are out there looking for drunk drivers because those hurt people. And I was sober and he let me go, right? Or I got this, something like that.
Right. Let me I return to this theme of the kind of like the beginning of your career, and and just ask you about mentors that helped develop you along the way. I mean, are there some that stand out?
Absolutely. Um, I look back to even as a young kid, my grandfather that, he flew airplanes in World War II, and he had a lot of really neat sayings. Like so many of us have those figures in our life as we're growing up, and that's probably where my service, that really drive for service and doing it the right way. He had a great
Mhm.
saying that I talk about all the time. When we'd finish a project in the garage, and it was good enough for government work, and that was always his comment. And you of course you get all of the background with that statement, but I knew what he really meant, right? It was because I know the detail that went into it in everything that he did. So that was big. But when I really look back on my career in the State Patrol, there's a couple of people that really stand out, and the first one is my first sergeant. And today it's really neat. He is the senior sergeant in our organization. But I look back to him frequently and what leadership that he displayed me. I try to mimic that to this day. He cared about me as a
Yeah.
human being, and he was willing to get his boots dirty with me. And on the next Monday or the next morning, if my boots weren't cleaned back up, he let me know that too. Right? It was a really neat man.
He must be. I don't want to embarrass you, but he must be really proud of you. And I think it's an important point that you make, because we encounter people along the way during our careers, and there's this metaphor of like dropping a pebble in the water and how the ripples ripple outward, and that's kind of the legacy we leave on the people we touch. And if you stop and think about it, that first sergeant is actually having an impact on the entire patrol. Now he's doing that directly in his own way as well, but through you and the other people he's touched and helped form, he's having a much larger impact than we tend to necessarily recognize.
I sure hope he's proud of me. He's a significant influence, and you're right. I talked about the same thing. It's relationships matter, and
Yeah,
yeah, I hope he's proud. That's for sure.
yeah,
We've
yeah,
got a special friendship, even with his family. It's neat.
yeah. Well, you've expressed a particular commitment to patrol member wellness and well-being. What is that, and how do you build it?
I've a couple of different things throughout the course of my career that really made that important, and even some of my own personal journey. When I look back in some of my assignments over the years, where you just kind of go with the flow, and I look back and I go, man, I wasn't doing very well at that time, and I don't know that I knew it, and I don't know that I knew where to go. But people like Master Sergeant Enlow were there for me, and even when I didn't ask for it, and you had some of those friendships. But it became pretty evident to me that not everybody had that. And then in our organization, all of a sudden, physical fitness became really important. And it was interesting to me was how resistant people were. We had leadership in the organization that was, we're going to have these standards, and if you can't do this, then and that's how it was being communicated. And I saw this incredible resistance. And another big influence, he's one of our lieutenant colonels now. We talked about, the only time I ever did push-ups was when I was in trouble. And now you want
Mm.
people to and you want people to do push-ups when we don't ask them to. It's punishment.
Hmm.
And so I realized that, this is a tough profession, and I want to retire and be good. And you see so many folks that retire and die because they didn't take care of themselves, whether it's mentally or physically. And so how do you that? I wanted to get people to recognize that on their own and do push-ups because it's good for them, right? And
Right.
not because the patrol is going to do it. But the other part, I spent, and Kumar, this is one of those things you could pull my string and I could talk for days about. But I spent time in charge of our criminal investigations branch, and during that time, troopers that worked for me, friends that worked for me, we sent to the theater shooting in Aurora,
Mm.
where they worked that crime scene. There was a horrible abduction and murder of a young woman in a suburb here that I asked troopers to go and be involved in. I've folks that, we know our fair share of pretty awful incidents. And I watched these troopers, every time something came up, because they're troopers,
Yeah.
they said, you need my help, I'll be there. and there's no thought to them what that was costing them personally. But we called for help, and they went. And I was watching them get trapped, and they weren't taking care of themselves. And I, without being too specific, I was watching their personal lives fall apart, and I was watching their mental health fall apart. And I felt, I certainly felt guilt about putting them in that situation, but I felt responsible to help them find a way. And the more I started to look at that, the more I realized that we had an obligation, but a tremendous responsibility to be on the forefront of the well-being of the people that do this. And we owe it to them because they are so willing to sacrifice all of that at the drop of a pin because their phone rang at 3:00 in the morning. They just go. And if we don't become active in that, and then bad things are going to happen to them. It's really important.
In one of my coaching programs, we talk about 10 factors of resilience and well-being. And actually, you've been hitting on a number of them. I mean, there's obviously the physical well-being. You talked about a little bit about meaning and purpose, and actually referenced it in one of your first answers in terms of connecting the work to other folks. You talked about social relationships. But this mental well-being, I think, is a particular challenge in our profession in the sense that there's a little bit in some organizations, a culture of I'm strong, I'm tough. How did you encounter that? And if so, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, we're a group of people that don't ask for help. We provide it. Right? That's
Right.
at the core of what we do. And I don't ever remember a sense, at least in our organization, where people were shunned upon, right, for needing help. It was certainly sad when it became apparent and we'd lost them. But then I realized that I didn't know where I was going to go. I mean, people would, I'm going to go talk to this person or that person. I'm like, I don't know. Especially when I was single, I don't know where I would go for that. So we needed to do that, and we needed to make sure it's okay. And so you just model that, right? And that's what we started working on, is model that it's okay to say you're broken or
Right.
something's not working. So it's absolutely been a challenge, but I'll tell you, it works when you talk about it. In fact, I was in a conversation earlier today where I'll bet you there hasn't been a week in several months where I wasn't talking to somebody where there was a reference to, hey, yeah, he's actually been really helped because he's been talking to doctor, or he's been using our peer support, or and those conversations, they just didn't happen 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Right.
We hit it.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also important because of the trauma. I mean, you've kind of already spoken to it in terms of the response to that the kidnapping and also the Aurora theater shooting, but also when we lose our own brothers and sisters. The patrol's lost 5 troopers that have been killed in line of duty since 2015. Would you please kind of unpack the hazards associated with being a trooper? Because I don't think that's necessarily as intuitive to a lot of the lay people out there in terms of the full spectrum of threats that a trooper faces.
Yeah, it's been an incredible stretch of time for really over the last 6 years of the patrol. Just to give you some context, 86 years that of an organization. We were founded in 1935. And like a lot of law enforcement in that time frame, there was several that would die every year from gunshots and things along those lines. Medical advancements obviously were a big factor in that. But 30 troopers, 30 patrolmen in 86 years, but we've lost 5 since 2015. And all 5 of them are engaged in real traditional trooper activity. They were on the road or on the roadside working on a previous incident. So Taylor Tifo was helping at a crash scene when a fleeing driver was trying to avoid some stop sticks, lost control, and struck and killed him. And he wasn't even a trooper yet. Officially, he was a cadet on a training ride at the very onset of his career. 6 months later, we had a trooper on the interstate trying to flag down, trying to stop a drunk driver while she covered another trooper on a crash. And this drunk driver struck and killed her instantly. 1 year later, 1 year and 10 days later, I had a trooper on the side of the road, again, helping another trooper in a car crash when a semi came through and crossed over the fog line and struck and killed him. And then just in 2000, that was in 16, then 2019, we had a trooper that was in a snowstorm, stopped to help a driver, and another vehicle lost control and struck Dan. And literally 2 months later, a trooper investigating a car crash, and he was struck. And was really challenging about that is in each of those incidents, they were engaged in activity that literally right now, there's probably 30 troopers in this state doing the exact same thing. And so recognizing this danger, and we continue to ask these folks to go out there and keep doing it. And even though that they know in the last, in some instances in the last 3 months, last couple of months, right, one of their brothers or sisters lost their life.
Right.
A pretty significant issue, right, and traumatic and easy to identify. And then you got to go home and tell your family that I'm going to go do this job that I know somebody just died doing.
I'm also interested, when I was the deputy director at ICE, one of our agents was killed in Mexico, Jaime Zapata. And it was really one of the first occasions when I dealt with the family, directly in that kind of a tragedy. And, there's just nothing that you can say. I mean, there's just no way, I think, to really bring as much comfort as you'd like to. And I'm just curious about how you approach these kinds of, how do you extend support to the family? How do you try to provide comfort and to help them appreciate, maybe that's the wrong word, but to just that the sacrifice, is honored and respect. How do you deal with it?
I think the first answer is it has to be real.
Yeah.
And that's not hard to connect to. And I'll tell you, when Taylor was killed, I was at the scene. I managed the scene, and I really didn't get to know his mother until later. But I look at when Jamie was killed, she was my trooper. I was her major. And I told her husband I could recount that moment of probably among the most challenging things I've ever done. In his front yard underneath their tree with the baby monitor in his left hand, told him that his wife had just been killed. And I knew he knew because standing at the scene, I saw his name on her cell phone as he kept trying to get a hold of her, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have that, and I know because he is a dear friend now. I know that he really did not like me that day, and I know from our conversations that Jamie, I don't know, that's afraid. She was afraid of me just because of my position. He'd say, I drop her off at work, and all the majors here, we got to get out of here, right? It's this culture thing, and in one context, I would never have known him. I shouldn't know him, to be honest with you, but because of what happened, we talk almost weekly. We meet for lunch, and I guess that's the direct answer to your question. Is you show them that you care, and what turns out is it's so easy for us to create friendships with people that do what we do because we have common values and we think very, very similar. It turns out that they marry people that are kind of like us too. Okay. And it's this morning having conversations with widows of our fallen members, and I think you got to put your money where your mouth is. It's really easy to say, we will never forget. We'll carve their name on a wall and we'll honor them once a year. But that's not enough. And that's not what it's about. And we're a family, and families call each other and talk to each other and pay attention. And that's how you work through it. And I got to tell you, that helped. It's been a big part of my, I'll use the term recovery as we manage through these things. And I didn't know Taylor because he was a cadet, but I personally knew these other folks. And it's neat for me to be able to have this connection now with their family, their kids, and their spouses. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's good for us all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess turning to a more positive note, what has been most satisfying about your law enforcement career?
There's a couple of different ways to answer that. I think this is a profession where you get to help people and you get to sometimes answer the unanswerable. We're a traffic safety organization, and the ability to connect with a victim and help them understand an otherwise ununderstandable situation is incredibly empowering. And I think it's been a big part of my success is understanding that value. It's as fun as it was when I was 23 years old, taking people to jail. What I really found my purpose was when I was standing in somebody's living room and explaining to them why their loved one died in a car crash and what happened, and providing that closure and that sense of comfort. That was so meaningful to me, and I've taken that now into my role now here as the chief, where I have the ability to help people understand and help them connect with their purpose, and provide solutions or ideas on how they can work through some of their struggle. It's been a really neat opportunity.
Matt, you keep emphasizing this idea of like connecting to their purpose. Where did that come? Was that something that was just organic in you when you showed up on the job, or is it something that, a value that someone handed on to you?
I guess I don't know. So it's probably a little bit of both. You talk about my grandfather, and
Yeah.
You don't do anything. I remember conversations with my dad growing up where he said, he goes, "Don't be a leaf, right? Don't be that leaf in the wind that goes where, don't be willing to land wherever somebody else wants you to land." And so that sense of purpose and finding that purpose became really, I wanted to be involved in where I was going to land, and that it just keeps showing up. And I because I'm the chief, I get to talk to our cadets on their, early in their training, and then remind them again in the graduation. And I'll tell every single one of them, I said, I could ask you today why you came here, and you all have your own reason. And you could give me the safe answer, like, I wanted to make a difference, but you have your reason. And you didn't accidentally become a police officer, in our instance, a state trooper. So I asked them at that moment to go write it down. And then on their graduation day, I said, you probably didn't do what I asked you to then. So I'm going to ask you to do it again on this day, on your graduation day, write it down. Because here's the deal, is there's days when this profession sucks. There's days when it's really hard, where you got to tell somebody that their loved one's dead, or when the weight of your responsibility catches up to you, or when society is looking at you and telling you how awful you are at your job. And you remember that I don't know very many cops that became cops, or members of the military that joined the military because they got a pat on the back every time somebody realized they did. You didn't do it for your personal gratification or somebody else's acceptance. You did it. You're willing to sacrifice because you believed in it. And that's what gets me through those dark days. And I'd like to think that's what gets a lot of other folks, is to go back to, why do you do what you do? And it's worth a hell of a lot of sacrifice that you've already given up. And why would you flush that now?
Right. Well, you, during your career, you served in a number of different roles, but that included as deputy director of the Colorado State and Local Fusion Center, nationally recognized. For those out there that don't know, what does a fusion center do?
It's a really neat program. You're out there looking at information and from a variety of different sources, and then making sure that as many people that need it have access to that, collecting, adding value to it, and then making sure all the right stakeholders have what they need to know to complete their mission. And that could be law enforcement, it could be fire, it could be critical infrastructure owners to help keep their products, their facilities safe. It's all of those things. And that, at the core, that's what they're doing, is making sure all of the right entities are connected, so we can be operating from as much of the same sheet of music as we can.
Now, I've been in my fair share of jurisdictional disputes or tensions over sharing sensitive information or protecting sources and methods and that kind of a thing. So would you comment on what your approach was to overcoming any of those kinds of concerns?
I think the first thing you have to do is build trust, right? And there's the old adage of don't introduce yourself on the day of the crisis, right? It starts right now, right?
See me before you need me.
Right? Yeah, that's a good one too. But so you gotta meet people, you gotta shake their hands, and then you gotta prove that you can help, and that you're reliable and trustworthy, and you're willing to do that. And that's really as we were growing our fusion center Gosh, it seems like yesterday sometimes, but that's what it was, right? It was going out and walking into a room and shaking somebody's hand and saying, "This is what I can do for you. If you just give me the chance to prove that it works." And it was rough at the start, but when you add value and you answer the phone, people start calling you, and that it's been neat. And I tell you, our state now, it's incredible what we can do as an agency, as a collective profession, I suppose, to solve some of these crises. It's pretty neat.
Well, let's come up to kind of more recent times. How does one become chief of the Colorado State Patrol?
Yeah, persistence. I'll tell you, if I were completely honest, there was when I started, like, man, I'd like to be the chief someday. And then I became a trooper, and I loved being a trooper. I said, I don't want to, this is great. Look at all these things I can do. And then I said, eventually maybe I'll be a sergeant. And I took the test, and then I thought I had that all mapped out. And I thought I knew the job that I was going to want and get. And then they threw me for a loop, and they said, we want to make you a sergeant, but we're going to send you to Trinidad. I said, well, if you know anything about Colorado, Trinidad is the last town on the southern edge. And I'm a city kid. But you know what? I said, all right, I'm in. And
did you have a family already at this point?
At that point, it's just me, so it was a little bit easier. But I said I'll give it a shot. And I tell you, I went down there, and I'm so thankful for that. It was good for me personally, but from a professional standpoint, it ended up being tremendous. I started to meet people and do things and get uncomfortable, and that's when you can start to grow. And I just realized, I'd been down there for a little while, and I got a call that said, "Hey, we'd like you to come up and do this job." And there was a whole bunch of reasons for me to say no to that. I had just bought a house. After living in a hotel for 6 months, I bought a house, and it was closed in May. And in December, they called and said, "We want you to come back to Denver for this job." But I'll tell you what, I lost my backside on that house. But I came back, and I moved in. This is kind of a funny story. I moved in with my mom and dad because I didn't have any money anymore. And then I met the woman that would be my wife 2 weeks later. And I remember asking her, I said, "Oh, so where do you live?" And I went, "Oh my goodness, she's going to ask me where I live, and I'm going to tell her I live with my mom and dad." And hey, it all worked out because I said yes, right? I said, here's an opportunity to go into a position that I knew nothing about. For the record, it was the fusion center position. And that I just look at that, and I have worked all along the way. I have never gone to a job or thought I was got the job that I thought I was going for. Every single time was, man, I don't know. I know nothing about hazardous materials. I wouldn't trade those experiences for the world. And I think that's really what led me to this job is when I was interviewing for it, I got to say I've done all these different things, and I was uncomfortable in all of them, but they made me better, more rounded. And I like to think that makes me a pretty decent chief of this organization.
Well, you said persistence, but what I'm also hearing as well is flexibility and adaptability. I mean, to have to be able to answer the call when they're looking to round you out with other assignments, and I imagine it makes you a better chief because you've touched a lot more of the organization.
I take the chance, but don't not only be willing to get uncomfortable, force yourself to get uncomfortable. It would be really easy to transfer back, right, to some place that I knew already. Right. But that's, boy, I will tell you now as the chief, you got to make it's a tough sell for somebody that's trying to get promoted, for me to put them back where they came from. It's because they're not going to grow. Right. But either is the agency, and not good options in my mind.
I would say probably a particular challenge for a statewide organization or a national organization, that's probably somewhat unique because of the distances that someone may be called upon to move to.
Yeah, you can work through those two, and it's easy for me to say, right? But when I was moving, I didn't have kids to worry about. But there's other ways, right, to find yourself. And it's what I tell our folks a lot too that are in rural Colorado with their family. They don't want to move. said, well, then find a way to connect elsewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's more than just this position. Plug into this project or go seek out other opportunities. And that's you can do it in other ways, I guess, is the point. It's as hard as it is. It's also easy to fall back, as that's your excuse for not growing.
Right. Well, what's the biggest myth about being chief? I mean, we all know you're all powerful.
You took the words out of my mouth. The biggest myth is that I'm in charge, right? It's neat. You have the ability to influence and make decisions, but you're along for a ride, right? And that's my wife asked me all the time. She goes, "When are you going to be home?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, I check my calendar in the morning and I go where it tells me to go, and then whenever the phone rings, that's probably the biggest myth, is that you're in charge, because only kind of.
Right. Well, and to your point, you can be held hostage to a bad story in the newspaper, or testifying, or whatever it may be. I know that that's certainly been my experience.
There's always something. There's something going back to well-being too. You have to be a little bit disciplined too, to know when you're tapped,
right?
And surround yourself with people that you trust and that are capable, but don't think like you, right? And you'll be okay.
Right. Now, leadership is leadership. I mean, and you exercise skills, and you don't even have to be in a formal position to exercise leadership. I mean, there's a leadership that just comes from informal authority and credibility. But as chief, what particular skills do you find yourself leaning on the most, or that are most called upon, if you were going to, focus on a couple or two or three?
Maybe I'm taking this in a different direction. I would tell you, compassion is what goes back to in compassion is you need to care, and perhaps the skill in that is empathy, is the ability to display empathy, to let folks know that you really do care. And there's that takes effort, not because you don't care, but it takes effort to be able to show that. And that comes from communication skills. It's the ability to be there in the moment, all of those things. But I think if you're going to be effective, if you're going to be able to lead an organization, it's not a position, like you said. Leadership is a verb. It's an action, and you're not a runner if you don't run, right?
Right.
You got to be. You're a leader, and it takes. You got to be engaged in it, and you got to do those things. And if you're going to be effective, then the people that you're leading need to know that you actually care about them, and it's not lip service.
I think you made a very important distinction there, because there may be leaders that have empathy and they care, but they might have difficulty displaying it, I think was the word you used. And that is such a huge component, because the troops we lead can't just like read our minds or divine what's going on in our hearts. So I think in authentic and sincere ways, it is really important to give them evidence of the caring. I mean, but it's got to be real. Can't be artificial.
Yeah, and here's I got bad news for folks: is you're going to make decisions that are the right decisions that are going to make people really upset. That they're going to be mad at you because they think you made a really dumb decision. But they'll forgive you, or they're willing to try to understand that if they believe that you care about them and that you're doing it with their best interest in mind.
Right.
And that, that takes time to build. You got to prove that you care. And then all of a sudden you have a lot more rope to work with.
Right. You're kind of hitting on this idea, this trust. This kind of, you said it earlier, care is an important component of that. And, making a deposit in that trust account so that when the inevitable withdrawals come, the balance can sustain it.
Yeah. Because I'll tell you what, when you, with the withdrawals are always bigger than the deposits.
That's why you got to make a lot of small and regular ones. Yeah,
totally.
Well, what surprised you the most about serving as chief? And maybe we've already touched on some of it.
I think another thing I like to talk about too is you never know all the way, right? You think you know what the job is, and then, I didn't know about all of this other stuff too, right? And so I think it was and I learned it pretty quickly, is in my role now, I'd like to think I've been successful in my career because I was always willing to step up and do things and go out. And uh, I, I don't do anything anymore. Right? It's this feeling. I don't feel like I've done anything for 3.5 years, but I also feel like I've been going nonstop for 3.5
Yeah,
years. That
right.
was the biggest surprise. Is that's not my job anymore, and that was a tough transition to make. Actually, is to let other people do things
Yeah,
and help set a vision and help develop the plan and build the road. But ultimately, other folks are going to do that stuff, and that was hard. But I
yeah,
tell you, once you figure that out, I tell you, it's pretty neat too.
yeah. Well, and I think you indicate you're not doing something, but you are also um, forming a culture, establishing a climate, setting a tone, laying down a vision. How do you do all these things to ensure that the patrol is a diverse, inclusive, and a high-performing organization?
There's another saying that talks about you can tell what's important to an organization by where they spend their money, right? And
Mhm.
the leader, whoever is on the top, can talk about how important things are, but look at their balance sheet, right?
Right.
Where are they spending their money? And sometimes it's not money; it's where are they spending their resources and all of those things. And I tell you what, you can talk about equity and diversity and inclusion and all those things, but if you're not putting resource to being successful and showing that why those things are important, then they're not. And I'll tell you, it's easy to talk about diversity in the sense of race or gender or things along those lines, and those are certainly important components to that. But diversity in thought and diversity in experience and diversity in perspective, all of those things are so important. And I mentioned it earlier, is people that are capable but don't think like you, right? That's
Yeah.
all of those things. Right? An agency like ours, it's around the state. Uh, we have to have people that can relate at that in those homes. And the best way I can talk about that is when I put on my uniform and I walk into a gymnasium full of people as a state trooper, they expect me to say, "Don't drink and drive, wear your seatbelt," and do all of those things. It's that the speech writes itself,
Hmm.
right? That's the expected. But where we have value is when we connect with somebody, or we have somebody that can connect with that community, and it's not in the gym, it's at home or at the restaurant, and they're talking about why all those things are important.
Right.
And the only way that you can do that is be trusted and be a part and be engaged in those communities. And that means you gotta be one of them.
Right.
And
Right.
that's it.
You become a more effective ambassador.
Yeah.
You know what also hits me though is I remember vividly when I was going through my master's program. We had the commissioner for Baltimore PD come and speak to us, and he talked about this. This is the diversity of thought and experience. He talked about how at one point he looked around at his command staff and he realized that they all had a SWAT background.
Hmm.
And I think there's an interesting lesson there because we maybe unconsciously will oftentimes surround ourselves with people that are in our comfort zone or that have similar backgrounds. There's a shorthand in the way we communicate. And the issue he brought up was is that when everyone that's sitting around the table is really adept at using a hammer, then every problem's a nail.
Yes. Yes.
And so he worked really diligently to try to round out the types of experiences of people that were his senior advisors, so that he could come up with more. He could test ideas and have more comprehensive solutions to the public safety challenges he faced.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I look at in the history of our organization, as the top has always been troopers.
Yeah.
In fact, by state law, the person that's the chief came up through the ranks. You can't be hired from outside. And then you get lieutenant colonels, and in order to be a lieutenant colonel, you had to be a major, and all the way down through, right, in certain time breaks. So what you end up having, right, are people that have literally the exact same resume
Mm-hmm.
for 20,
Mm-hmm.
25 years, and it's no wonder that change doesn't happen, right? And quite frankly, in law enforcement, we had a lot of white men that were leading the organization, right? That
Mm-hmm.
worked and came through the same. And we weren't able to connect with the people that we are hiring even on accident. And as you're recruiting and trying to get people, it's not working. So we made one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is where we can, we're bringing outside perspectives, right? And on our command staff now, we have people in positions that aren't uniform, that are coming and bringing from a different background, that didn't go to the same training. And I'll tell you, we have grown as an organization so much since we went outside and found that perspective. And you can do that without forfeiting your heritage and your tradition and all those things.
Right.
But we're so much better for it. We're doing things today that number one, people thought were never possible, and that it was so foreign. It's.
What's an example of that?
We have so our chief of staff. So this is a position that we never had before, and it's someone that I've worked with for several years, and I trust her. But she's never been a cop, never. In fact, she started with us in the Fusion Center as an intel analyst, right? And it was an internship. But we found herself, and long story short, she is a member of the executive command staff. She is one of 5 of us that lead this organization every day. And we'll sit in our weekly meetings and management meetings and talking about things. And her perspective is so different. And we're talking about things like pursuit tactics, right? We had a meeting yesterday talking about how we're engaging in pursuits. And you ask police officers how you should engage in a pursuit, and most police officers say, well, you chase them and they're running for a reason, right? But you can have somebody else's perspective that says, well, maybe it's because whatever that might be that's so foreign to us. And you need to look at it from this. It's not about catching the bad guy. It's looking at all these other things. So it's probably not the best example, but it's just that different perspective that because someone is totally different, or a great one, a gender issue, or you're talking about certain things that are synonymous with men. And in this profession, there's a lot of men. Mm-hmm. And she could provide an example of why that makes her incredibly uncomfortable. I just don't have that perspective because I've never had to be in that situation.
Yeah. What would you identify as the most significant leadership challenge the patrol faces today?
14, 15 months ago, I would have told you leading this organization through, and it continues to be a challenge, through our tragedy over those last 5 or 6 years, is convincing people that I know it's dangerous, but we're going to get through it. And we did a lot of really neat things, and we're doing a lot of really neat things that people feel safer today at work, and they are safer. But I think today, with all the pressures on law enforcement and the talk about being in a fishbowl, it's like a fishbowl with magnifying glass, right? They're looking at every stone, every hair, and there's a lot of people that are willing to provide their thoughts on how you should do what you do, and now they're from a police officer, a trooper's perspective, they're taking away all the protections at the same time, and it's pretty scary, and it's a challenge. I was talking about it to some folks earlier. 2 weeks ago, we had 2 troopers that were parked behind our office and thought they were in a really safe place until a car drove by and fired 5 rounds at them. The only reason they shot at them was because they were police officers. And these are people that made specific choices to be where they were because they thought they were safe and had calculated why, and that was stripped from them. So now you're asking these people to give up potentially their life, right. But realistically, you're giving up your physical well-being. You're giving up your time, your thoughts, your so much to do this job, and they don't feel like it's appreciated. Right. And I got to tell you, I don't want to live in a place that doesn't have a strong law enforcement. Yesterday, I was listening to a speaker that's what makes this a democracy. Right? It's a key to our democracy, and I don't want to live a place without that. Right. And we lose it without good men and women that are willing to step up, and that's a challenge.
What, in your view, do we need to do for our profession to kind of reclaim, well, I don't even want to say reclaim, well, because we're an honorable profession, but there's this perception out there. What do we do, I guess, to reclaim the narrative around the truth of just the self-sacrifice that so many law enforcement officers on a day-to-day basis are making? How do we connect better with the public?
Yeah, so maybe this takes it a different way. I think we need to stop talking about us publicly. I think, and I will, don't get me wrong, this is an incredibly noble profession that is filled with incredible men and women that do incredible work every day. But what we have not done well at all as a profession, in my view, is understand why folks feel the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
And our solution thus far has been to talk about it. And I've been criticized by troopers and by members of this organization is, how come you haven't stood up and said, that's not us? I said, because then I'm acknowledging that it might be. Like I know it's not us, and I'm sorry, but me frankly saying that's not us isn't working because that's what we've been doing. We talk about it all the time, and we publicize that. But that narrative isn't being listened. And what we're not doing is understanding why people have that perspective. We're not asking that question. And I think if we're going to be successful in restoring this more symbiotic relationship between law enforcement and the people that we're here to serve, right, is that we have to understand why they have the perspective that they do. And the only way we're going to do that is be willing to go into a room and listen. And I go back to that story I talked about of sitting in that committee room at the state capitol and having, I could have sat there with my head down and rolled my eyes about one bogus story after the other and go, yeah, I have no confidence that that's the way that happened, right? Or that was the right. Listen and take the moment to sit back and say, all right, I understand that perspective. This is another hot topic for me right now is law enforcement started, you talk about the canons of back in Europe when it was the police are the people and all that stuff's great. But I got news for folks that law enforcement in this country doesn't have a crystal clear history. Right. In fact, there was law enforcement that was used in pretty atrocious ways not that long ago. Our history is young, and there's people who were impacted by that that are still alive today. And I talk about my grandfather, and guess what? They talk to their kids and their kids, and those people, their perspective of this profession is based not on their interaction, because a person might only have 2 or 3 interactions with a cop their entire life. Yeah. Their perception is based on what their family told them and how the community they grew up in, that narrative. And we don't do a good enough job of acknowledging that that's the truth. Yeah. And understanding. And we're not the police of the 1960s or the 1950s of those eras where some atrocities were done. We're not, but we just can't say that. We need to acknowledge that happened and say, all right, I get your perspective and I value your perspective. And that'll get us in the door. And then maybe that gets us the opportunity to talk about who we are today and what we have in place to prevent those things from happening before. I think that's, we don't need at this point, we don't need a bigger megaphone. I think what we need is maybe a mute button and the ability to sit down and listen. And we haven't been great at that.
Let me challenge you on that a little bit, because I remember we had a recent shooting of the young lady that had the knife in the hand that was attempting to stab her friend. I remember reading an article, and you had to go about 7 paragraphs in before you ever got to the point where you knew that she was armed with a deadly weapon.
Right.
Do you find that the coverage is fair in terms of episodes that may play out with respect to the organization you lead? Now, and by the way, as I ask that question, I recognize, well, life isn't fair and we got to put on our big boy and big girl pants. But the reason I ask is because then does that place more of an emphasis on us figuring out how to tell our story if we're not getting fair coverage?
I think anybody that tells you the coverage is fair is foolish, right? There's no doubt about it. There's a reason I read 3 or 4 papers in the morning is to
Right.
get all sides of it, right? And somewhere the truth is in the middle. So and I have the same. I think there's several. That story that instance is all over. But I guess the point that I'm making is finding the other news outlet to talk about, the fact that's not going to work either, because the message is being heard only by the people that are wanting to listen to it. And so if we can go to these conversations and go to these outlets and talk about why we do what we do and what we're doing to prevent that from occurring and find that story, I think that's great. And talk about the culture that we're having, that we're building, and what we're trying to be as organizations, as a profession. Let's talk about that and have that narrative be defined by what we're hearing from the people that we're serving, as opposed to what we think our newspaper or our media outlet is telling us they want.
Right. One of the things that I always admired about state and local policing is, I think more so than federally, there's a premium on establishing trusted relationships with members of the community. It's not that the feds don't do it. It just, at least in my experience, there hasn't been the same kind of emphasis or need in the same way that a major city police chief, or I would imagine you as a chief of the Colorado State Patrol, the relationships that you have to have that extend into the community. Have you found in your experience that buys you more grace, that they because there's a trusted relationship, because you've invested in it, that they're able to be advocates for what you are trying to do and the people you're trying to lead?
100%. And it goes back to don't introduce yourself in a crisis, right? We are going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. And obviously you need to, if you're trying to hide them, you're going to lose. But your ability to talk about those mistakes and talk about what you're going to do and actually be heard requires you to have those relationships in advance. And I'll tell you, it's tough for us as well. Because we're on the highway, we're on the road, we're not necessarily in the schools and at the grocery store. We're different, but that doesn't mean those relationships aren't as important. We got to find those to have. And for us, maybe that's legislators, it's representatives that are coming from these communities. But every state trooper lives in a neighborhood somewhere, and to make sure that we have that to help folks understand. I'm repeating what you said, Kumar. You're absolutely right. Those are really, really important. But if you're hoping to make those, you're not making those relationships right now, in a community that's not trusting of you. Right.
Well, we are at the end, but before I let you go, I want to ask you, if you had to boil down your leadership philosophy to a few key essentials, what would they be? Now, you've talked a lot about connecting to purpose. You've talked about care. What are some other things that people should really kind of have in mind if you're going to try to simplify this and just boil it down to the essentials?
We've talked about a lot today, right? Caring and showing that you care and helping people connect with their purpose. But I try really hard to surround myself with people that are willing to provide input. And, just because I can make the decision doesn't mean I should, right? And I think where I can is to help push some of those decisions down, to see what others might do and help them understand the different perspective. I think that helps them grow as a leader. But really surround myself with people with a diverse thought that maybe are an expert, maybe they're not, but they'll provide their feedback before I make a decision. I was told when I'm promoted to captain that almost none of the decisions you make as a captain are emergencies. And you can always reflect and seek some guidance and input. And I've carried that through. Sometimes you got to be willing to make them, but engage other people, you'll be better for it.
Thank you. Matt, thank you for spending the time with us today and sharing lessons learned. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about the Colorado State Patrol?
You can go to Google Colorado State Patrol. You can go right to our website and learn a lot about us. You can certainly follow me on Twitter and Instagram as well. I think it's Colonel COL at COL Packard on Twitter, and we talk a lot about it. I'm pretty proud of this organization, what we do, and we'd love for you to learn more about us.
Thanks, man.
Take care, Cooper. It's good to see you.
Yeah.